May 1940. The German army launches its offensive in the west. On paper, the French army is the strongest in the world. It has more tanks than the Germans. Many of those tanks are superior to anything the Wehrmacht fields. The French have the backing of the British Empire, and they're defending on home soil, behind the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line. 6 weeks later, France surrenders. The campaign is over, and the world is in shock. How does the army with the best tanks, the most guns, and decades of military tradition collapse in the time it takes to film a Hollywood movie? The answer isn't about hardware. It's about mindset, doctrine, communication, and a fatal misreading of how war had changed. Let's find out why the French army of 1940 was stronger on paper, but lost where it actually mattered. The myth that France was hopelessly outgunned is just that, a myth. Let's look at the numbers. The French had around 3,000 tanks facing roughly 2,500 German tanks. On the ground, they had numerical parity when counting Belgian and Dutch forces. And in terms of individual tank quality, the French often had the edge. Take the Char B1 bis. This was a monster of a tank. It had 60 millimeters of armor on all sides, virtually invulnerable to German anti-tank guns at standard combat ranges. It carried 2 cannons, a 75mm howitzer in the hull for destroying bunkers and a 47mm gun in the turret for hunting tanks. Compare that to the most common German tank of the campaign, the Panzer II, which had only 20mm armor and a 20mm gun that was practically useless against the B1. German Panzer IIIs and IVs, their better tanks, had only a slim chance of penetrating a B1 at ranges under 100 meters. German panzer crews reported that French B1s could shrug off dozens of hits. One French tank, the Jeanne d'Arc, kept fighting after being struck 90 times before finally being knocked out by an 88mm flak gun. The only reliable weapon against it in the air, the Luftwaffe did have superiority, roughly 4,000 operational aircraft against about 1,800 Allied aircraft in France. But even here, the French and British fighters were competitive. The British Spitfire and Hurricane were excellent planes. So the French weren't being swept from the skies by miracle weapons. So if the French had the equipment, why did they lose so fast? The answer begins in the trenches of World War I. France suffered catastrophic losses in the Great War. Over 1.3 million dead. Entire villages were wiped out. The French didn't just remember that war. They were traumatized by it. Everything about French military thinking in the interwar years was shaped by one goal. Never again. This produced a doctrine called La Bataille Conduite, the methodical battle. It was logical, coherent, and entirely defensive. The French planned to fight a slow, controlled war where firepower dominated. They would hold defensive positions, let the enemy bleed against their fortifications, and only advance under overwhelming artillery support. Tanks? In French doctrine, tanks were support weapons for the infantry. Mobile pillboxes meant to help the foot soldiers advance in a methodical, controlled manner. They weren't to be used as independent, massed formations. The French spread their tanks thinly across infantry divisions, rather than concentrating them into powerful armored fists. The Germans lost World War I. But they drew a completely different lesson. They decided that the next war had to be mobile, fast, and decisive, no repeat of the 4-year stalemate. They developed a doctrine that embraced speed, maneuver, and combined arms. The famous German tradition, going back to Frederick the Great, was always to attack. For the Germans, tanks were the tip of the spear. They concentrated their armor into panzer divisions, self-contained combined arms formations with their own infantry, artillery, engineers, and logistics. And crucially, every German tank had a radio. This is where the French tank advantage evaporated. The Char B1 bis had a one-man turret. That meant the tank commander had to command the crew, spot targets, aim the gun, and load the weapon. He was doing 4 jobs at once. And his tank's radio was so rudimentary that it could only send Morse code. The audio receivers were so bad they were drowned out by the tanks. Engine noise. French tank communication was essentially non-existent compared to the Germans. But the biggest failure wasn't on the battlefield, it was on the map. The French believed the Ardennes forest was impassable to a large armored force. The dense woods, winding roads, and rough terrain made it impossible for tanks to move through. So they left the Ardennes sector thinly defended by second-line troops. the Ninth Army under General Korup and the Second Army under General Hunziker. The French High Command was certain the main German attack would come through Belgium, just as it had in 1914. So they put their best troops there, ready to rush forward and stop the Germans. The plan was called the Dill Plan, a forward defense into Belgium. But General Erich von Manstein had a different idea. He proposed sending the main German armored thrust through the Ardennes. Army Group A, with most of the German armor, would smash through the forest, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and then race west to the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. The rest of the German forces would act as a decoy in the north, drawing the best French and British troops into Belgium. On May 10th, the Germans launched their attack. The French and British rushed into Belgium, just as the Germans expected. The decoy worked perfectly. Meanwhile, 7 panzer divisions pushed through the Ardennes. The French Ninth Army collapsed. The German armor crossed the Meuse on May 12th. By May 13th, the French defensive line was broken. The Germans were racing toward the Channel. The French command structure couldn't react. It was centralized, old-fashioned, and reliant on landline communications and runners. By the time orders were sent and received, the situation had completely changed. French officers were reportedly frantically leafing through tactical manuals trying to find the right protocol while German tanks were already crossing the river. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps, spearheading the advance, was racing faster than the French could respond. This wasn't just a tactical victory. It was an operational collapse. What happens when an army's entire way of war breaks down in the first week of battle? The French logistical system collapsed. The Char B-1s, with their enormous fuel consumption, started running out of gas. More French tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel than were destroyed in combat. The German Luftwaffe dominated the skies over the battlefield, preventing the French from reinforcing or launching counterattacks. French morale shattered. The High Command became defeatist. General Maxime Weygand, who took over command after Gamelin was sacked, was already looking for an armistice. The 84-year-old Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun in World War I, reportedly slept through most war cabinet meetings. By May 20th, German tanks had reached the English Channel. The British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies were cut off in the north. The British evacuated from Dunkirk. The rest of France was left to fight on alone. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice. 6 weeks. The strongest army in Europe, defeated not because its soldiers were cowards. The regular French troops fought bravely and often with distinction, but because its leadership was trapped in the past. The French tank was superior to the German tank. The French artillery was excellent. The French army had more guns and often fought well. The Char B-1 bis should have been a war-winning weapon. But war isn't won by equipment stats. It's won by how you use what you have. The Germans had radios, the French didn't. The Germans had a doctrine that emphasized speed, initiative, and concentration of force. The French had a doctrine that emphasized control, method, and defense. The Germans gambled on a bold plan through the Ardennes. The French assumed the enemy would do what they did in 1914. 1940. The German army thought in terms of moving fast and striking hard. The French thought in terms of holding ground and fighting methodically. The Germans created a system where a tank commander could use his initiative, where a general like Guderian could bypass orders and push forward to victory. The French created a system where everything was planned in advance, and where responding to the unexpected was nearly impossible. The result: a campaign that should have been a defensive war of attrition, exactly what the French planned for, became a lightning war of maneuver that the French had no answer to. The French army wasn't weak, but it was old-fashioned. And in 1940, that was the one thing it couldn't afford to be. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like. Good luck.